Thousands of years ago, an entire civilization vanished without a trace. A thriving society buried beneath layers of earth and forgotten by time. But what force could erase a civilization from history? Was it nature, war, or a catastrophe? No one survived. Today we uncover the mystery of the civilization that disappeared. If you love lost history and ancient mysteries, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us on this journey into the forgotten past. The first thing the earth gives back is not a palace, not a treasure chamber, not the carved face of a king staring across the centuries. It is a room, a low-buried room pressed beneath a weight of ash and hardened mud, its walls still standing where they should have fallen, its floor still holding the last scattered grammar of ordinary life. A grinding stone lies tilted near one corner. A clay jar has cracked under pressure, but has not moved far from where someone left it. Near the doorway, the dark stain of burned timber marks the place where a roof beam gave way. The air when the soil is opened carries no memory of voices, yet everything about the place suggests interruption. Not abandonment over years, not slow decay. Something faster, heavier, and more absolute entered this settlement and closed it like a hand. The civilization beneath this earth has no famous name that schoolchildren repeat. No surviving epic tells of its last day. No monumental inscription declares that its rulers conquered the horizon. What remains is quieter, and in some ways more disturbing, the evidence of a people who built, planted, traded, buried their dead, repaired their homes, marked their seasons, and then disappeared so thoroughly that later ages walked above them without knowing they were there. Their world does not return through legend. It returns through layers. A grey seam of ash, a band of flood clay, a floor sealed under fallen walls, seeds carbonized before they could rot, bones carrying the chemistry of diet and migration, pots broken not by time alone but by the sudden force of catastrophe. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story buried here is not only about one lost settlement, it is about the frightening ease with which a human world can pass from daily routine into geological record. At first the site looks almost peaceful. The landscape above it has had centuries to soften the violence. Grass covers the low mounds, wind moves across the fields, birds cross the same sky that once darkened over the settlement. From a distance there is no obvious sign that a community lies underneath, compressed into silence. But when archaeologists cut into the ground, the calm surface begins to separate into time. The upper soil belongs to later farmers, later animals, later weather. Below that are disturbances, roots, burrows, old pits dug by people who never knew what they were cutting through. And then suddenly the catastrophe appears as a boundary. The colour changes, the texture changes. Human history stops being gradual. In that buried layer, the settlement is caught in a final posture. Walls lean inward. Storage vessels remain near hearths. Some tools are still placed where hands would have reached for them. In one building, the floor may hold spilled grain, as if a container overturned during flight or collapse. In another, a line of stones suggests a threshold worn by years of footsteps before the entrance was sealed forever. What survives in the record suggests a society neither primitive nor grand in the way ancient kingdoms are often imagined, but deeply organized around the needs of survival, memory, and place. These were not people drifting at the edge of history. They had chosen this landscape because it offered something: water, soil, stone, timber roots through neighbouring valleys, perhaps a sacred mountain or a river whose floods once promised renewal rather than ruin. And yet the same landscape that allowed them to endure may have become the instrument of their disappearance. That is the first unease in the story. Civilizations do not grow apart from nature. They grow inside its patterns. A river that feeds fields can also drown them. A volcano that enriches the soil can also bury the village in a single morning. A mountain slope that shelters a settlement can loosen after rain or shaking and come down as a moving wall of earth. A coast that opens trade to distant strangers can, under the right conditions, turn into a corridor for a wave. The evidence remains incomplete, but the buried city shows signs of being overtaken not by one simple misfortune, but by the kind of event that leaves nature and human life fused into a single layer. There is a particular strangeness in places destroyed quickly. Slow ruins invite imagination in a different way. A deserted city can look like a place that exhaled over generations, losing people, house by house, courtyard by courtyard, until only stones remained. But a rapidly buried settlement feels almost too intimate. It preserves timing. It suggests decisions made under pressure. Someone may have tried to gather food. Someone may have run toward higher ground. Someone may have believed the worst would pass. Someone may have waited too long. Scholars still debate how much can be reconstructed from such traces because archaeology is careful with the dead and cautious with silence. A pot near a doorway is not a diary. A burned roof is not a scream, but patterns matter. When many small details point in the same direction, they begin to form the outline of an event. The catastrophe did more than kill or scatter people. It erased a name. That is harder to imagine than destruction itself. Many ancient disasters were remembered because survivors carried the story forward. Eruptions became myths of angry mountains. Floods became divine punishments or ancestral warnings. Collapsed cities became ruins with names attached, places later travelers could point to and say that a people once lived there. But here memory failed or was broken. Perhaps the survivors were too few. Perhaps they merged with neighbouring groups and stopped speaking of the old settlement after a few generations. Perhaps later cultures built their own explanations over the land, never suspecting that beneath their fields lay a world older than their stories. No single explanation fully accounts for this silence. The silence is what gives the buried civilization its power. It asks what counts as history when no text survives. It asks whether a people vanish when their names are lost, or whether they remain present in the burned seed, the tool edge, the child's bead, the wall built by hands that expected another season. It asks how many other communities lie beneath ordinary ground, not because they were insignificant, but because disaster removed them before they could be woven into the memory of later ages. The first excavators who recognize the buried layer are not simply finding ruins. They are finding an interruption in the human story. Above the catastrophe, life eventually resumes in some form. Plants return, animals cross the land. Later people cultivate, build, and bury their own dead. Below it lies an older rhythm cut short. Between them is the disaster itself, a line drawn by firewater, mud, or shaking earth. That line becomes the doorway into everything that follows. To understand the lost civilization, it is tempting to begin with the moment of destruction, because catastrophe has a dark gravity. It pulls attention toward the final hour. But the buried people were not only victims of their ending, they were makers of a world. Before the ash or mud covered their roofs, there were mornings when smoke rose from hearths, fields that needed tending, paths worn by trade and kinship arguments over storage, and water rituals performed because the seasons had to be persuaded to return in the right order. The disaster matters because it froze a living society in place, but the society matters because it had something to lose. So the ground opens and the first room becomes more than a room. It becomes a threshold. On one side is the quiet modern landscape where the catastrophe is invisible unless someone knows where to dig. On the other side is a forgotten world built carefully enough to endure, yet fragile enough to be sealed away in a single violent turn of nature. The story begins there under the weight of Earth, where a civilization without a remembered name waits to be understood, not through its kings, but through the final arrangement of ordinary things. Long before the ground closes over the settlement, the place announces itself as a promise. It is not the kind of promise written in law or carved into stone. It is older and more practical than that. Water moves nearby, either in a river that bends through the valley or in seasonal channels that wake after rain, and spread a skin of moisture across the low fields. The soil is dark enough to hold roots. The hills around the basin provide stone for building clay for vessels, fuel from scrub and woodland, and a horizon that can be watched for weather, strangers' smoke and signs from the mountain. To a passing traveller, the landscape might look exposed, even uncertain. To people who know how to read it, it is a place where a community can take hold. The first settlers do not arrive as shadows. They arrive with knowledge carried in bodies and habits. They know where animals pass. They know which plants return after fire and which slopes keep water longest. They understand that a valley is not only a shelter, but a machine of seasons, gathering rain from heights, feeding grasses, drawing game, and laying down fresh silt when floods remain gentle. What survives in the record suggests that the people who built here were not careless in their choice. Their settlement rises where several worlds meet upland and lowland wild pasture, and cultivated field local stone and distant goods, the fixed rhythm of farming, and the unpredictable opportunity of travel. That meeting of worlds matters. A forgotten civilization rarely begins with a single dramatic invention. It usually forms through accumulation. A path becomes a route. A seasonal camp becomes a hamlet. A hamlet becomes a permanent village with storage pits, walls, hearths, and places where people return to bury their dead. The landscape rewards repetition. Each year of successful planting makes the next year more likely, because families improve terraces, learn the moods of water, save seed, and remember which corner of the field failed when the rains came late. Each repaired roof is also a declaration that the people expect to stay. At the center of this buried world is water, as it so often is. Water gives grain its chance, softens clay, for pottery supports animals, and fixes human attention to one place. But water is never simply generous. It has to be guided, watched, and negotiated with. In dry months it shrinks into channels and hidden pockets. In wet months it may surge over its banks and leave behind a slick layer of silt. The same flood that nourishes one field can cut away another. Small communities learn this tension with an intimacy that later empires sometimes forget. They build where they can reach water, but not, they hope, where water can easily reach them. They place houses on slight rises, use ditches or low banks, and choose storage areas where grain will remain dry. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the buried floors and settlement layout suggest people attentive to both abundance and danger. The climate during the civilization's rise may have been more favorable than the landscape appears today. Many ancient settlements sit in regions that later became drier, harsher, or more unstable, and the ruins can deceive modern eyes. A place that now seems marginal may once have held seasonal wetlands, thicker vegetation, more reliable springs, or cooler patterns of rainfall. Pollen trapped in sediment microscopic plant remains, and the chemistry of soils can reveal this lost environment more clearly than the present surface. Sometimes the surprising detail is not that people lived in a difficult place, but that the place was not difficult in the same way when they chose it. Scholars still debate the exact boundaries of ancient climate zones in many regions, but again and again the ground tells a similar story. Landscapes move through time, and civilizations are often built during windows of opportunity that do not stay open forever. This valley or basin or coastal plain becomes useful because it connects rather than isolates. Trails cross it. traders, herders' marriage, partners, ritual visitors, and seasonal migrants move through. A piece of obsidian from a distant source, a shell carried inland, a pigment not found nearby, or a pottery style borrowed from another region, can reveal that the forgotten settlement was part of a wider human map. It may not have ruled that map, and it may not have stood at its centre, but it participated in it. This is one of the quieter corrections archaeology often makes. The people later forgotten by written history were not always isolated. Many were linked by exchange networks too subtle to leave grand monuments, but strong enough to move ideas, tools, foods, and stories across surprising distances. The surrounding hills provide another form of protection and risk. They frame the settlement, giving it orientation. Mountains and ridges are useful landmarks visible from fields and paths. They catch clouds, send down streams, and offer places for grazing animals when the lowlands are crowded or wet. They can also be sacred. Long before formal temples rise as distinctive peak, spring cave or cliff can become part of how a people imagine their place in the world. The mountain may be watched not only for weather but for meaning. Smoke tremors, strange lights, new springs, dead fish in streams, or unfamiliar smells from the earth may be interpreted through ritual before they are understood as geological warnings. No single explanation fully accounts for how ancient communities understood such signs, but it is clear that environment and belief were rarely separate. The soil itself is a kind of archive. Beneath the houses before the burial layer there may be older occupation surfaces, hearth ash, post holes, animal pens, and dumps of broken pottery. These are not glamorous remains, but they show persistence. A settlement that lasts leaves mess. It leaves repairs. It leaves layers of mistakes and adjustments. A wall built over an earlier wall means the house mattered enough to rebuild. A hearth renewed in the same place means the family rhythm held. A storage jar patched instead of discarded means resources were valued. The catastrophe that later seals the settlement preserves a final moment, but the layers beneath preserve duration. The people choose this place because it offers balance, not safety in any absolute sense, because no such safety exists near river slopes, fault lines, or volcanoes, but a working balance between nourishment and threat. For generations that balance appears to hold. Children learn the paths between houses and fields. Elders remember floods that came high, but not too high, winters that tested the stores, but did not empty them, tremors that frightened animals, but did not bring the walls down. The community grows into confidence, and confidence has its own danger. The longer a landscape behaves, the easier it is to believe its violence belongs only to old stories. Yet the land is never still. Sediment gathers in channels. Slopes loosen grain by grain. Pressure builds beneath stone. Weather patterns shift beyond the scale of a human lifetime. The same forces that make the valley fertile continue to work quietly around the settlement, storing the possibility of change. The forgotten civilization rises inside that long patience of nature, surrounded by gifts it cannot fully control. Its fields, walls, paths, and hearths all depend on an agreement the earth has never actually signed. Inside the settlement, the catastrophe is still far away. The people do not live as if they are waiting to become evidence. They live inside ordinary demands that repeat with the sun water, to carry grain, to grind animals, to watch clay, to shape roofs, to mend meals, to prepare debts, and favours, to remember births, to celebrate sickness, to endure deaths, to place carefully back into the ground. From the outside, centuries later, the buried rooms may seem still and mute, but before the layer of destruction seals them, they are crowded with motion. Smoke darkens rafters. Footsteps wear thresholds smooth. Children learn which jars are not to be touched. dogs nose near hearths for scraps. The floor is swept, dirtied, swept again, and slowly becomes a record of human repetition. The houses reveal a society built less around spectacle than around endurance. Their walls may be mud brick, stone, packed earth, timber, or some combination shaped by local resources. Their roofs depend on beams, reeds, brush, clay, and the constant labour of repair. Nothing in such architecture is passive. A roof is a seasonal task. A wall has to be watched after rain. A floor must be resurfaced when pits ash and traffic roughen it. What survives in the record suggests households that understand materials intimately, not as abstractions, but as things handled every day. Clay cracks if dried too fast. Stone shifts if laid badly. Timber rots where moisture lingers. A civilization can be measured by monuments, but it can also be measured by the competence hidden in a straight wall and a hearth that draws smoke well enough to make a room livable. Food ties the community to its landscape with even stronger knots. Grains are harvested, dried, stored, and guarded against damp insects, rodents, and theft. Pulses, fruits, gathered plants, fish, birds, or hunted animals add variety when the season allows. Herded animals provide meat, milk, hides, bone, manure, traction, and status, though not always in equal measure. A single seed preserved by charring can speak more quietly than a royal inscription, but it can say something essential these people planned beyond the present meal. They expected hunger to come at predictable times, and they built their lives around defeating it in advance. Scholars still debate the exact balance between farming, herding, foraging, and trade in many buried societies, because preservation favours some foods and erases others. Still, the storage spaces, grinding tools, animal remains, and plant traces suggest a world where survival is not improvised. It is organised. The daily sound of the settlement is shaped by work. Grinding grain is not a brief task. It is a hard, repeated pressure of stone against stone, often performed for hours, leaving microscopic wear on tools and visible strain on bodies. Pottery making begins with clay dug from suitable deposits, cleaned, tempered with sandshell chaff or crushed sherds, then shaped by hand or slow wheel, dried, fired, and put into use. A vessel is never just a container. It is technology. It cools water through evaporation, protects grain, ferments drink, cooks, stew, carries oil, and stores memory in its form. Even decoration when present is not simply ornament. It may mark household identity, regional style, ritual meaning, or learned tradition passed from hand to hand. One of the lesser-known truths about ancient life is how much information hides in broken things. A complete pot can be beautiful, but a heap of sherds can be more revealing. Breakage shows use. Repair holes show value. Soot marks show cooking methods. Residue inside a vessel can preserve traces of oils, grains, wine, dairy resin, or medicines depending on the site and conditions. A jar abandoned full tells a different story from one cleaned and stored upside down. A cooking pot left near a hearth speaks of routine. A storage vessel shattered in place under a collapse may speak of suddenness. The people beneath the ruins are known not because they intended to speak to the future, but because daily life leaves fingerprints even when names vanish. Social order is present, though it may be subtle. Some houses are larger. Some contain more storage capacity, finer vessels, imported materials, or specialized tools. Others are modest, repaired, often crowded into narrower spaces. This does not necessarily mean a kingdom, a court, or a rigid class system. Inequality can exist in small communities without palaces. Authority can sit in elders, ritual specialists, successful farmers, traders, lineage heads, or those who control access to water and stored food. The evidence remains incomplete. and no single explanation fully accounts for every variation in household wealth. But differences in building size, diet, burial treatment, and access to rare goods suggest that this forgotten civilization has structure. It is not a shapeless village. It is a network of obligations, advantages, tensions, and inherited roles. Belief moves through the settlement in ways that are harder to recover but impossible to ignore. People do not build lives only around calories and shelter. They mark thresholds, bury offerings, arrange bodies, preserve ancestral places, avoid certain spaces, return to others, and place meaning in objects that may look ordinary to outsiders. A small figurine, a carefully positioned stone, a pigment-stained surface, a child buried with beads, an animal skull set apart from butchery refuse, none of these can be interpreted carelessly. Archaeologists have learned caution from too many confident mistakes, yet patterns of placement can reveal ritual behavior, and ritual behavior reveals how people imagine danger, fertility, death, and continuity. A community living under a restless mountain near an unpredictable river, or beside a changing sea, may fold environmental uncertainty into ceremony long before science names the forces involved. The human body carries another archive. Teeth preserve childhood stress diet and sometimes origin. Bones record heavy labor injury, disease, and habitual movement. Isotopes can show whether a person grew up locally or arrived from somewhere else. Ancient DNA, where it survives and where ethical permission allows study, can reveal kinship, migration, and population history. But the dead must not be reduced to data. Every skeleton is also a life that once had a face, a voice, a place, at meals, a set of relationships that cannot be fully reconstructed. What survives in the record suggests a community both local and connected, rooted in its landscape, yet not sealed away from the wider world. Children are among the easiest to forget in grand narratives of civilization, but they are everywhere in the archaeology of lived space. Small footprints sometimes survive in hardened clay. Miniature vessels may be toys, training objects, ritual items, or all three depending on context. Where patterns on floors show where families gathered, worked, and moved. The lost civilization is not merely a system of production. It is a world of learning. Children watch adults shape clay-sort seeds, tend animals, carry water, and read the sky. They inherit stories about dangerous seasons and generous places. They learn the settlement as a map of permission and warning, where to play, where not to go, which storage room matters, which elder commands respect, which path leads to the fields, which ridge darkens first before rain. By the time Catastrophe approaches, this society has become deeply invested in continuity. Its people have buried generations in or near the land. They have improved fields whose value depends on memory. They have built homes that hold not just shelter, but ancestry. Their civilization may not possess writing, or if it does, none may survive in the buried layer. It may not have armies known to later chronicles, nor kings whose names outlast their bones. But it has the central feature of every human world, a shared belief that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to justify labor. Seeds are saved because there will be another planting. Walls are repaired because someone will sleep beneath them. Children are taught because the future is expected to arrive. That expectation is what the catastrophe will violate. Not simply life, but continuity. Not simply buildings, but the confidence that the landscape can be trusted. For now, though, the settlement breathes under an open sky. Hearth smoke rises. Grain dust clings to hands. The river moves in its channel, or the mountain watches from the edge of vision, quiet enough to be accepted as permanent. The people beneath the ruins are still people of the surface, still joined to weatherwork, memory, and hope. unaware that one day the smallest objects they leave behind will have to tell their story alone. The settlement does not become a civilization in a single leap. It thickens slowly like sediment in a quiet basin. One house becomes a cluster of related households. A cluster becomes a district of familiar doors, shared workspaces. Paths refuse pits, animal pens, and storage rooms, whose contents matter not only to one family but to the survival of many. The old paths between fields grow deeper under repeated feet. The place where people gather for exchange becomes more permanent. A building repaired 3 times begins to hold a memory larger than its walls. In this way, a rising world can hide inside ordinary continuity. Nothing announces that history has changed, yet the evidence left in the ground suggests that the community is becoming more complex, more interdependent, and more difficult to abandon. Growth first appears in the handling of food. A small household can survive with a few storage jars and a careful memory of what is owed to whom, but a larger settlement needs broader systems. Grain must be collected, measured, protected, moved, and redistributed. Some stores may remain domestic, guarded by families and lineages. Others may belong to communal arrangements, ritual authorities, or emerging elites whose power rests less on weapons than on timing. Whoever controls stored food controls the hungry weeks before harvest, the feast, after ritual slaughter, the seed required for planting, and the ability to support specialists who do not farm every day. Scholars still debate how much centralized authority can be inferred from storage alone. But large bins, repeated storage facilities, and restricted access spaces suggest a society learning to manage surplus as both insurance and influence. Surplus changes everything. It allows some people to become unusually skilled at tasks beyond subsistence. Potters refine forms that are more standardized and durable. Stone workers produce tools with greater consistency. Weavers, basket makers, bead makers, builders, herders, traders, and ritual specialists may begin to spend more time within their craft. This does not mean leisure in the modern sense. Specialization can be demanding, hereditary, and tightly bound to obligation. But it does mean the settlement is no longer only a place where every household does roughly the same things. Differences sharpen, skills travel, styles become recognizable. A vessel found far from its place of manufacture may carry the signature of this growing world more faithfully than any written name. Architecture becomes another sign of rising complexity. Early houses may have been practical and similar, shaped mainly by available materials and family need. Later structures begin to show planning beyond immediate shelter. Some are larger, better built, or placed in prominent positions. Some contain benches, platforms, courtyards, decorated surfaces, or controlled entrances. A wall that guides movement can also guide social behavior. A raised platform can turn an ordinary room into a place of authority. A courtyard can gather people for work, ceremony, negotiation, or judgment. What survives in the record suggests that the forgotten civilization is beginning to organize not just space, but experience. People are meant to move through certain routes, pause in certain places, and recognize that some areas are more important than others. At the same time, the settlement's relationship with a wider region deepens. Imported goods, when they appear, do more than prove trade. They reveal desire. A distant stone blade, a shell ornament from the coast, a rare pigment, a metal object, or a style of pottery, borrowed and adapted from another community, shows that people are looking beyond the horizon. The object may be practical, beautiful, sacred, prestigious, or all of these at once. Its value lies partly in distance. To own or display something from far away is to hold a piece of another landscape within one's own. In societies without money as later ages understand it, Exchange is often tangled with kinship marriage, alliance, obligation, ritual, and rivalry. A gift can be generous and political at the same time, which is a very old human habit. One surprising detail often found in such rising communities is that standardization can appear before strong kingship. People sometimes imagine ancient complexity as a pyramid with a ruler at the top, but archaeology often shows coordination without obvious monarchy. Pottery forms become similar across many households. Weights, measures, or sealing practices may emerge. Building techniques repeat. Decorative patterns spread over a region. This could reflect shared identity, craft training, ritual norms, market exchange, or administrative control. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every case. Still, these patterns show a society beginning to think beyond the isolated household. It is creating habits that allow strangers, neighbours, and distant partners to trust that certain things mean the same thing in different places. Ritual spaces also begin to matter more. They may not resemble temples in the later monumental sense. A ritual building can be modest, even plain, if its power comes from repeated use rather than scale. It may contain unusual deposits, clean ash animal bones selected differently from kitchen waste figurines, special stones, painted plaster offerings placed under floors or vessels broken deliberately. These acts are difficult to read with certainty, but they indicate that the community is investing labour in relationships with ancestors, spirits, gods, forces of fertility, or the dangerous landscape itself. If the settlement lies near a volcano, floodplain fault, or unstable slope, ritual may also be a way of negotiating with uncertainty. Human beings often turn repeated fear into repeated ceremony. The dead become part of the rising world as well. Burials can mark territory, ancestry, and belonging. Some people may be buried under house floors, keeping family lines physically beneath the living. Others may be placed in cemeteries that gather the community into a shared memory. Differences in grave goods, body treatment, orientation, or location can reveal status, age, gender, kinship, or ritual distinction, though archaeologists must interpret these signs carefully. A rich burial does not always mean a powerful person, and a poor burial does not always mean an unvalued life. Yet burial practices show that the civilization is building depth. The land is no longer only useful, it is ancestral. To leave it would mean leaving the dead. As the settlement grows, so does vulnerability. Complexity creates strength, but it also creates dependence. More people require more food. More fields require more reliable water. More storage invites more conflict over distribution. More specialized labor depends on farmers producing enough surplus. More trade links bring valuable goods, but also expose the community to disruption. A small hamlet can scatter more easily when drought, disease, or political tension arrives. A larger settlement invested in architecture fields, graves, and status becomes harder to move. Success roots people in place. That rooting can become dangerous when the landscape changes. The rising world also changes the land around it. Trees are cut for fuel beams, tools, and cleared fields. Herds graze slopes and may reduce vegetation that once held soil in place. Irrigation or flood management, if present, alters channels and sediment. Fields expand into marginal areas during good generations because population and ambition push outward. None of this implies carelessness. Ancient people often understood local ecology with remarkable precision. But even careful land use leaves traces, and over time human pressure can make a landscape more sensitive to drought, flood erosion, and slope failure. Scholars still debate how much environmental degradation contributed to many ancient collapses, but it is rarely wise to imagine humans and nature as separate actors. They are braided together long before disaster strikes. At its height, the forgotten civilization may have looked stable from within. Its people had routines that worked. Its craftsmen produced recognizable goods. Its farmers knew the fields. Its ritual calendar gave shape to the year. Its elders and leaders, whoever they were, could point to full jars, repaired walls, established paths, and the graves of ancestors as proof that the world held together. This is the quiet confidence of a society before a breaking point. It does not need to be arrogant, it only needs to be accustomed to survival. Yet beneath that confidence, the same forces continue gathering. The river remembers larger floods than any living person has seen. The mountain holds pressures older than the settlement. The slopes above the fields loosen slowly through seasons of rain and heat. Climate can shift by degrees too subtle for one generation to recognize until the old rules fail. The civilization rises because it learns the landscape well, but it cannot know every scale on which the landscape operates. Human memory is long compared with a harvest and short compared with geology. That difference will become the hidden weakness in everything they have built. The first warnings do not arrive as a single unmistakable message. They come in fragments the way nature usually speaks before catastrophe. A season slightly out of rhythm, a spring that weakens earlier than expected, animals restless before dawn, a crack opening in a wall that had stood for years, a river carrying more silt than usual, a tremor felt at night and explained away by morning. Nothing in these signs has to mean disaster. Ancient communities lived with variation constantly. Some years were wet, others harsh and dry. Some floods damaged fields but left behind fertile mud. Some quakes frightened people but spared the houses. The difficulty then as now is knowing when ordinary instability has become the beginning of something larger. In the generations before the burial, the landscape may have begun to change in ways that were visible only if someone was patient enough to compare one lifetime with another. A channel that once held steady begins to wander. Flood deposits thicken in low fields. Hillsides lose more soil after storms. Trees that once shaded slopes become scarcer near the settlement, either from climate stress fuel, demand grazing, or all of these together. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how much pressure came from human land use and how much from broader environmental shifts. But sediment can sometimes preserve a story of increasing disturbance, heavier runoff, more erosion, more debris moving through the system. The land does not collapse at once. It becomes easier to unsettle. If the forgotten civilization lies in the shadow of a volcano, the warnings may be stranger. Volcanic mountains can sleep so convincingly that people build entire identities around them. Their slopes are fertile, their springs rich, their stone useful, their outlines sacred. For decades or centuries they may offer no more than faint fumaroles, warm ground, mineral smells, or small tremors. Then the signs begin to multiply. Water sources change temperature or taste. Fine ash may fall from a small eruption far from the main settlement. Animals avoid certain areas. At night a glow may appear high on the slope, or a plume may stand above the mountain like a dark tree rooted in the sky. No single observation necessarily predicts catastrophe, and ancient people would have interpreted such phenomena through inherited beliefs. Yet what modern geology recognizes in these details is unrest pressure rising through old pathways, rock fracturing gases escaping, magma moving where no eye can follow. If the threat is water rather than fire, the warnings are more familiar but no less dangerous. A river floodplain teaches people to expect periodic violence. They build slightly above it, raise thresholds, store food carefully and remember old flood marks. But rivers are not machines with fixed limits. A rare storm in the hills can send a wall of water through a valley under clear skies downstream. A landslide can dam a river temporarily, creating a hidden lake that later bursts. Sea storms can drive water inland, especially where settlements cluster near estuaries for trade and fishing. In some buried sites, thick layers of mud and chaotic debris suggest flooding powerful enough to erase normal boundaries between field street and house. What survives in the record suggests that people may have known water as both partner and enemy, but not necessarily as the force that would end their world. There are also warnings that no one can read because they unfold beneath the earth. Fault lines store strain silently. Slopes absorb water until their internal strength fails. Cavities weaken. A long period of drought can harden soils, and the sudden return of heavy rain can make them unstable. An earthquake does not need to be the only catastrophe. It can be the trigger that releases others. Shaking can crack walls, break storage jars, ignite fires from hearths, loosen cliffs, redirect springs, or collapse riverbanks into channels. No single explanation fully accounts for every buried destruction layer because real disasters often arrive as chains. The earth shakes, a slope fails, a river is blocked, water rises, mud moves, fires start. And by the time the evidence is sealed, the final layer contains traces of several forces acting together. The people of the settlement would have noticed some signs and missed others. They may have responded in practical ways, repairing walls, deepening ditches, moving animals, rationing stores, reinforcing roofs, clearing channels, or offering more frequent rituals at a spring shrine ancestor place or hilltop. A community does not simply stand still before danger. It interprets, argues, adapts, and sometimes normalizes. If a tremor passes and the sun rises daily, work resumes. If a flood damages a field but the next harvest recovers, the event becomes memory rather than warning. Human beings are built to continue. That instinct is often what allows survival, but it can also make danger seem manageable until it is not. A lesser-known clue to environmental stress can appear in food remains. Seeds from later occupation levels may show a shift toward hardier crops, smaller grains, more weeds mixed with harvests, or signs that fields were becoming less reliable. Animal bones may suggest changes in herd composition, slaughter age, or hunting pressure. If people begin eating more wild resources, more young animals, or stored foods at unusual times, archaeologists may suspect strain. These clues are delicate and easily overread, yet they matter because collapse rarely begins on the day of catastrophe. It begins when the margin of safety narrows. A society with abundant surplus can absorb a bad year. A society already stretched by drought, conflict, disease, or population pressure can be broken by the same event. The warning signs may also have appeared in human bodies. Teeth can record childhood malnutrition. Bones can show repetitive labor intensified by changing demands. Injury patterns may suggest rebuilding after storms conflict over resources or accidents in unstable terrain. Burials may become more hurried, more numerous, or less richly furnished in times of hardship, though such interpretations require caution. The record is uneven, and grief does not always leave a clear archaeological signature. Still, bodies sometimes preserve the slow pressure before the sudden end. They reveal that catastrophe is not only a geological moment but a social condition. The disaster strikes a community already shaped by years of negotiation with risk. Inside the settlement, however, life must continue through uncertainty. Grain still has to be ground. Children still have to be fed. Animals still wander if fences fail. Clay still dries when the weather allows. A crack in the earth, a strange smell from the water, or an unusually dark horizon may trouble the community. But trouble alone does not empty a village. To abandon ancestral land is not a simple act. It means leaving houses built by parents, graves of kin fields improved over generations, and social ties that may not transfer elsewhere. Even when danger is sensed, staying can seem more rational than flight. The land has been dangerous before. It has also been generous. This is the tragedy hidden inside the first warnings. They are not silent. They are ambiguous. Nature rarely announces which disturbance is survivable, and which one belongs to the beginning of an irreversible chain. The forgotten civilization has endured enough ordinary hardship to believe endurance itself is proof. Its people have seen storms pass, tremors fade, riverbanks rebuilt, harvests fail and return. The past teaches resilience, but it also teaches the wrong lesson when the coming event is outside living memory. Beneath the fields, pressure gathers. Above them, smoke rises from hearths as usual. The settlement stands between two kinds of time human. Time measured in meals, repairs seasons and generations, and earth time patient enough to wait until every warning looks almost like something that has happened before. The day the sky changes may begin with a kind of false normality. Dawn comes over the settlement in a familiar colour. Smoke lifts from hearths. Animals shift in pens. Someone steps outside to judge the air, the slope, the river, the clouds. If there have been warnings, they have become part of the background of life, folded into routine with the uneasy skill human beings have always possessed. A tremor is remembered, but the walls still stand. A strange smell in the water is troubling, but water must still be carried. The mountain has muttered before. The river has risen before. The ground has cracked before and then held. Catastrophe often becomes recognizable only after the ordinary morning has already begun. Then the scale changes. If the disaster is volcanic, the first unmistakable sign may be sound, not a single explosion at first, but a deep pressure moving through air and ground felt as much in the chest as heard by the ear. A column rises beyond the fields, darkening upward, carrying pulverized rock, glassy ash, steam and gases into the sky. Daylight weakens. Fine particles begin to fall at first, almost delicate dusting roofs, shoulders, jars, paths and leaves. People may have time to stare. They may have time to gather children, animals, food tools or sacred objects. That small interval can be the cruelest part of an eruption, because it gives the appearance of choice while concealing the speed with which conditions can turn impossible. Ash is not like ordinary dust. It is abrasive, heavy when wet, dangerous to breathe, and capable of collapsing roofs if it accumulates thickly enough. It blinds paths and erases familiar landmarks. It turns water foul. It muffles sound, then amplifies panic in strange ways. A settlement that knows its lanes by memory can become disoriented when the sky darkens, and every surface turns the same dead grey. What survives in the record may be a layer of ash settled evenly across floors and courtyards, but the lived event is not even. It is confusion, coughing, darkness, animals, breaking loose families trying to decide whether to shelter or run. Scholars still debate how much warning people in such buried communities had, because the archaeological layer preserves the result better than the minutes that led to it. If the catastrophe is flood-borne, the transformation may come not from above but from a sound rising through the valley. Water moving at destructive force does not arrive like a quiet river. It carries stones, branches, mud, broken trees, animal bodies, pieces of upstream houses, and the grinding noise of the land itself being rearranged. A flash flood can descend from storms far away, where no rain is falling over the settlement. A dammed lake can fail suddenly after days or months of hidden pressure. A storm surge can push water into streets that have known ordinary tides for generations. In such moments, the familiar route to the fields becomes a channel. The courtyard becomes a trap. The storage room becomes a basin filling from the threshold upward. Mud is a different kind of darkness. It moves with weight and memory, taking the shape of channels, but also forcing new ones. It enters houses, low lifts, objects, spins vessels, packs against walls, and then hardens around what it has swallowed. People caught in mud flows may be unable to move even when the surface seems shallow. Walls can stand for a moment, then fail under lateral pressure. Roofs collapse not because they burn, but because supports shift beneath them. In the archaeological record, mud can be merciful to objects and merciless to lives. It seals wooden beams, seeds, footprints, baskets, mats, and fragile surfaces that would otherwise vanish. The same force that destroys the settlement also preserves it with astonishing care. Earthquake adds another rhythm to disaster. It is sudden, bodily, and impossible to negotiate with. The ground, the one thing assumed to be stable, begins to behave like water. Walls crack along old weaknesses. Roof beams jump from supports. Storage jars burst against floors. Hearth fires scatter. People fall before they understand direction. If shaking triggers landslides, fires, or floods, the first catastrophe becomes only the opening movement. A building can collapse in seconds, but the aftermath can trap survivors in a world where paths are blocked. Dust fills the air, and aftershocks keep turning rescue into danger. No single explanation fully accounts for every ancient destruction layer, because earthquakes are often partners in crime, leaving behind tilted walls, crushed vessels, burned debris, and sudden abandonment that can be difficult to separate from the events they triggered. The forgotten civilization may have faced not one clean disaster, but a compound one. A volcanic eruption can melt snow or unleash rain on loose ash, creating lahars that move like wet concrete through valleys. An earthquake can fracture a volcanic slope or release a landslide into a river. Heavy rainfall after drought can send entire hillsides down over fields and houses. Fire can follow shaking. Flood can follow fire. Disease and hunger can follow them all. Modern people often prefer disasters with names and categories, but the past does not always obey them. The evidence remains incomplete, yet many buried sites suggest sequences rather than isolated moments. Ash under mud burn layers beneath collapsed flood deposits, cutting through occupation surfaces, repairs begun and then overwhelmed. Inside the settlement, the final decisions are small and urgent. A family may leave a meal unfinished because the air has become unbreathable. A potter may abandon unfired vessels that will never become useful. Stored grain may be left behind not because it has lost value, but because no one can carry enough of it through darkness or water. Valuables may remain in houses because survival has become more important than ownership, or because there is no time to reach them. The absence of certain objects can be as telling as their presence. If portable goods are missing, some people may have fled early. If everything remains, destruction may have come too fast. If bodies are scarce, evacuation may have partly succeeded. If bodies are concentrated in sheltered spaces, some may have waited for safety in the wrong place. The sky by then is no longer background. It presses down. Whether filled with ash storm cloud smoke or dust from collapsing earth, it removes the horizon, and with it the ordinary sense of distance. A community that once read its landscape confidently now sees only fragments, a doorway, a wall, a hand, an animal shape in grey light. Water at the knees, sparks in the air, falling grit on skin. The world narrows. Civilization in that moment is not architecture or trade or ritual. It is the attempt to keep hold of another person while the environment becomes unrecognizable. By the time the violence passes, if it passes within hours, the settlement has crossed a boundary no one inside it could name. Some people may have escaped to higher ground ridges, neighbouring hamlets, boats, caves, or open fields beyond the worst flow. Some may have died inside rooms that later archaeologists uncover with painful care. Some may have survived the first day only to face hunger, cold contaminated water grief, and the impossibility of returning home. The catastrophe does not end when the ash stops falling or the water withdraws. It ends, if it ends at all, when the living understand that the place they knew is no longer a place where life can resume. Behind them the settlement is transformed into a sealed archive. Roofs sag, walls steam or drip, mud settles in corners, ash deepens in silence. The tools of daily life are buried in the positions of interruption. The mountain, river slope or sea that made settlement possible has also remade it into evidence. The day the sky changes becomes the day human time is swallowed by earth time, and a civilization that expected another morning begins its long descent into forgetting. After the violence, there is a second catastrophe quieter than the first, but just as decisive. It is the burial itself. Fire, flood, ash, landslide, or shaking may break the settlement in hours, but burial changes the broken place into something else entirely. It removes it from weather memory and return. A damaged village can be rebuilt if its walls remain visible and its fields can be cleared. A burned house can be swept out. A flooded room can dry. But when earth covers the doors, when ash fills courtyards, when mud hardens over floors, the settlement stops being a place people repair and becomes a place people stand above. The difference is enormous. It is the difference between disaster and disappearance. The first layer settles unevenly. Ash drifts into sheltered corners and lies thick along the leeward sides of walls. Mud enters low spaces and presses against whatever resists it. Collapsed roofs create cavities that later fill slowly with silt dust, insects' roots and falling debris. In some rooms, objects remain almost where people left them. In others, water rearranges everything, floating jars, bones, baskets, tools and beams into confused piles. What survives in the record suggests that burial is not a single blanket laid gently over a city. It is a set of physical processes, each with its own violence. The ground preserves, but it also edits. If volcanic ash is the sealing agent, it can create a strange illusion of stillness. Fine ash falls through air like grey snow coating surfaces, with a softness that hides its danger. Layer upon layer compresses under its own weight. Rain turns it heavy, then solid. Over time, minerals move through it, binding particles together until the catastrophe becomes a kind of stone memory. Organic materials trapped quickly may carbonize decay in place, or leave impressions where the original object disappears. A wooden post may vanish, but leave a hollow. A basket may rot, but leave the curve of its weave impressed in sediment. A footprint may survive because ash was wet enough to receive it, and dry enough to hold it. These are delicate accidents, and scholars still debate how much of a buried scene reflects the exact last moment, and how much reflects the hours, days, or years after. Mud preserves differently. It is heavier, more intrusive, more capable of entering the private spaces of the settlement like an invading body. It packs around vessels, fills ovens, seals, storage bins, and can hold seeds in conditions where air cannot easily reach them. When it dries, it hardens into a form that protects small details from later disturbance. But mud also carries objects away, mixes layers, and can make destruction look more sudden or more chaotic than it was. A body found in flood sediment may not have died where it is found. A tool lodged in a doorway may have been washed there. Archaeology has to move slowly through such deposits because every object may be both evidence and traveller. No single explanation fully accounts for the final arrangement until geology and human traces are read together. Burial also interrupts memory in practical ways. Survivors, if there are survivors, may return first with hope. They may come back after the sky clears, after waters fall, After tremors cease expecting damage but not erasure. What they find is almost unlivable. Roofs are collapsed. Wells are fouled. Grain stores are buried spoiled or unreachable. The paths between houses are gone beneath slick mud or deep ash. Bodies, if visible, may be too dangerous or too difficult to recover. Tools may lie only a few steps under the surface, but those steps are now a wall of compacted disaster. The people may dig where they can reclaim what they can mourn where they can, and then turn away. That turning away is the beginning of forgetting. It does not happen because people do not care. It happens because survival is urgent. Refugees need shelter, food, water allies, and new fields. Children need to be moved before sickness spreads. Herds must be saved if any remain. Seeds must be found for the next planting somewhere else. A community under shock cannot devote endless labor to excavating a dead settlement, especially if the land itself seems cursed unstable or ritually dangerous. The old home becomes a mound, a scar, a warning, perhaps a forbidden place. In the first generation, people may still know exactly what lies beneath. In the second, stories shorten. In the third, names begin to blur. The landscape assists the loss. Plants root in the new deposits. Rain smooths the ash. Wind rounds sharp edges. Animals burrow. Sediment washes from higher ground and spreads over the buried walls. If the region remains habitable later, people may return to the area without rebuilding the old settlement directly. They may farm the surface reuse stones from exposed ruins, cut pits without understanding the older layers, or build shrines over places whose original meaning has been lost. If the region becomes less hospitable, the mounds may stand empty for centuries, mistaken for natural rises. The civilization is not hidden by intention. It is hidden by the patient work of ordinary processes after an extraordinary event. There is a lesser-known irony in many buried catastrophes. The more completely a place is sealed, the more completely it may vanish from living memory, yet the more richly it may survive for future study. A settlement left exposed can be robbed, weathered, rebuilt, quarried, and erased by later occupation. A settlement buried quickly may be forgotten, but its forgetting protects it. Floors remain intact because no one walks on them. Food remains in jars because no one empties them. Fragile objects survive because no later builder clears them away. The catastrophe destroys the civilization's future while preserving its final evidence with almost cruel precision. Still, preservation is never complete. The dead are not all found. The spoken language is lost unless writing survives. Songs, myths, jokes, gestures, kinship terms, and the emotional meanings of objects mostly disappear. Even when houses are preserved beautifully, they are only shells without the full living world that animated them. What survives in the record suggests habits, choices, technologies, and relationships, but not the totality of experience. A sealed room can make the past feel near enough to touch, yet it also reminds the observer how much has passed beyond recovery. Over years, the buried settlement becomes geology to those who do not know its story. Its walls become lines inside a mound. Its disaster layer becomes a stratum. Its tools become inclusions in compacted earth. Human intention is translated into texture at colour, dark hearth, ash, pale plaster, red, burned clay, grey, volcanic fall, brown flood, silt black carbonized grain. The civilization enters the language of sediment. This is not poetic from the ground's point of view. It is simply what happens. Earth receives everything eventually. But for human beings, the transformation is unsettling. A world of decisions becomes a layer someone can measure with a trowel. By the time later centuries pass over the site, the forgotten civilization may have no defenders left in memory. Its descendants, if they survive, may carry fragments without knowing their origin. a pottery style, a crop variety, a ritual gesture, a warning about a mountain, a place name whose old meaning is lost. Neighbouring cultures may absorb refugees and with them pieces of language, craft and ancestry. But the settlement itself remains silent. It has been cut off from the chain by which societies usually preserve themselves. No annual procession returns to its central shrine. No ruler claims descent from its founders. No storyteller knows the exact arrangement of its streets. The burial is therefore not merely physical. It is historical. It seals walls, but it also seals identity. It creates the condition in which a civilization can become anonymous. And anonymity is one of the deepest forms of loss, because it leaves evidence without a voice attached. The buried rooms still hold the shape of human life, but they no longer know what they are called. Above them the world continues, seasons pass, new grasses rise, rain falls on the mound and runs down its sides. The disaster becomes part of the landscape's appearance, rather than an event in anyone's mind. Beneath that surface a jar remains tipped on a floor, a threshold remains worn by vanished feet, and the last day lies pressed under earth and silence, waiting for a future that will not remember the people by name, but may learn slowly and carefully how they disappeared. Those who survive do not step out of the catastrophe into safety. They step into a world that has lost its centre. Behind them lies the buried settlement sealed under ash-mud rubble or waterlogged debris. Ahead of them is a landscape that may be wounded in every direction, fields stripped or poisoned. Paths cut away, springs fouled, animals scattered, familiar landmarks hidden by dust or flood deposits. Survival begins not as triumph, but as disorientation. The people who escape carry more than fear. They carry the sudden knowledge that the place which gave their lives order can no longer hold them. At first they remain close. This is what displaced people often do when disaster has not yet settled into certainty. They gather on ridges, higher terraces, neighbouring hamlets, dry ground. Beyond the mudline or sheltered caves at the edge of the valley, they look back. They wait for the sky to clear, for water to fall, for aftershocks to stop, for the mountain to quiet, for someone to return with news from the buried streets. What survives in the record rarely captures this first waiting because refugee camps are often archaeologically faint. Temporary fires, trampled surfaces, hastily butchered animals, and scattered tools do not always survive clearly. Yet it is likely that the catastrophe produces such edge places, unstable pockets of the living around a newly dead centre. The first practical problem is water. A community can lose houses and still endure if water remains clean. But disasters frequently attack water sources first. Ash turns streams bitter and abrasive. Floods fill wells with silt carcasses and waste. Earthquakes shift springs or muddy them for days. Landslides block channels and create stagnant pools. People who once knew every reliable source now have to test the landscape again under pressure. A spring that saved generations may be unusable. A stream that looks familiar may carry invisible danger. The evidence remains incomplete, but sudden changes in settlement patterns after major disasters often suggest that water more than sentiment decides where survivors can remain. Food follows closely. Grain buried in storage rooms may still exist only a short distance away, but distance is not measured in steps now. It is measured in depth of ash, instability of walls, danger of renewed flow, and the labour required to dig without tools, shelter, or certainty. Some stores may be recovered, others spoil. Herd animals may have died, fled, or become desperate enough to be slaughtered quickly. The surviving people may live for a time on what they can carry, what neighbours can spare, and what the damaged landscape still offers. This is where the catastrophe spreads beyond the moment of impact. Hunger is the long echo of the first destruction. Neighbours matter intensely. A forgotten civilization is never truly alone, and its survival may depend on surrounding communities, whose own fate varies by distance, elevation, and fortune. Some nearby settlements may be damaged but intact. Others may be overwhelmed. Trade partners may become hosts, rivals, rescuers, or opportunists. Refugees bring skills, kinship ties, stories, and need. They may be welcomed because marriage alliances or obligations demand it. They may be resisted because stores are already strained. No single explanation fully accounts for what happens after a disaster, because human responses range from generosity to violence, often within the same society. But archaeology can sometimes detect sudden shifts. New pottery styles appearing in another settlement, changes in house forms, larger storage needs, unusual burials, or signs that population has moved. The survivors themselves are not a single group. Some are elders who know the old boundaries, rituals, and genealogies. Some are children who will remember fragments but grow up elsewhere. Some are craftspeople whose specialized knowledge suddenly becomes portable wealth. A potter can shape clay in a new village if the right materials exist. A herder can rebuild a flock slowly. A ritual specialist may carry song ceremonies or ancestral authority into exile, though the sacred places that gave those rites power may now be buried. A farmer's knowledge is more painfully tied to land, the exact slope of fields, the timing of floods, the texture of local soil. To be uprooted is not only to lose property, it is to lose the map by which competence was proven. One of the surprising details in post-catastrophe societies is that disaster can both erase and spread culture. The buried settlement disappears as a visible centre, but its people may carry its habits outward. A decorative pattern on pottery may appear in a neighbouring valley. A crop practice may be adopted elsewhere. A word, a ritual gesture, a style of bead, or a house-building technique may travel with displaced families. Later archaeologists might see influence without knowing it is the shadow of refugees. In this way, the civilization may survive most strongly at the very moment it seems to vanish. Its name is lost, but pieces of its world enter other worlds, yet exile changes memory. In the first years, the catastrophe remains sharp. Survivors can still describe which house stood where, who escaped, who did not, which path became impassable, where the final smoke or water came from. They may return to perform mourning rites at the edge of the buried place if the land allows. They may leave offerings on the new surface, unable to reach the old floors below. They may forbid children from playing there. The site becomes not simply a ruin but a wound. But memory carried under pressure does not stay unchanged. As families rebuild, the story has to fit new needs. It becomes a warning, an origin tale, a reason for migration, perhaps a sign that old powers failed or that new rituals are required. Later generations inherit a thinner version. They know that their elders came from a place covered by earth or burned by sky. They may know the direction but not the layout. They may remember a mountain, a river, a night of darkness, a season without harvest. The names of individuals fade first, then the names of houses. Then the settlement's name may survive only as a strange word attached to a mound, a cursed field, or a place avoided after storms. Scholars still debate how oral traditions preserve memories of ancient disasters, because some appear to retain remarkable echoes across long periods, while others transform beyond recognition within a few generations. The evidence is uneven, but the process is humanly familiar. Memory survives by changing. The wider region also has to adjust. Trade routes that once passed through the settlement may bend elsewhere. A market or ritual gathering place may shift to a rival community. Leaders who depended on the buried centre lose authority, while those who control safe land gain it. If the disaster affects fields across a broad area, migration may become more than a local movement. Families may enter distant valleys, uplands, coasts, or plains carrying pressure with them. Conflict may follow not because catastrophe makes people cruel, but because scarcity narrows choices. A full granary can make generosity possible. An empty one makes every stranger a question. In the ruins of the old centre, salvage may continue for a while. Survivors or later visitors dig into accessible edges, recover beams, stones, tools, ornaments, or stored goods. Such activity can confuse the archaeological record. A house may look looted, but the looters may be its own former residents. A grave may be reopened not by enemies, but by descendants trying to retrieve ancestors or offerings. Valuables missing from one building may indicate successful evacuation rather than poverty. The ground preserves traces, but intention must be inferred carefully. What survives in the record suggests that the boundary between abandonment and return can be porous for years. Still, the settlement's role is broken. It no longer gathers life inward. It pushes memory outward. The survivors become the fragile bridge between a buried world and everything that comes after. If they are absorbed into stronger neighbours, their identity may dissolve quickly. If they remain together, they may found a new settlement and carry the old one as an ancestral catastrophe. If too few survive, the story may end almost entirely, leaving only biological descendants, scattered artifacts, and a silence that later scholars will mistake for total disappearance. The tragedy is not only that people died, it is that the survivors could not carry everything. They could carry children, tools, seeds, stories, perhaps a sacred object wrapped in cloth, perhaps the memory of where the dead lay beneath the new earth. But they could not carry the fields built over generations. They could not carry the exact sound of the settlement in the morning. They could not carry the authority of a doorway worn by ancestors' feet, or a ritual place whose power came from being precisely there. Civilization is portable in fragments, but much of it is made from the relationship between people and place. So the forgotten people move along the edge of their own erasure. Behind them, the buried city hardens into landscape. Around them, other communities decide how much room the displaced will be allowed to take. Within them, memory begins its difficult transformation from lived experience into story. Some fragments will survive, others will fail, and beneath the sealed rooms the old world waits without breath, while its surviving children learn how to become strangers somewhere else. Centuries later, when the ground is opened again, the first evidence does not explain itself. A line of stones may be a wall, a drain a boundary, or the edge of a collapsed room. A dark patch may be a hearth, a burned beam, a rubbish pit, or the stain left by something organic that vanished long ago. A jar may be where someone placed it, where a flood rolled it, or where later disturbance dropped it from a higher layer. The buried civilization returns not as a complete story, but as a field of clues, each one requiring patience before it can be trusted. Archaeology begins here in humility, because the ground preserves fragments with astonishing generosity and equally astonishing silence. The most revealing evidence often lies not in spectacular objects, but in their arrangement. A bronze ornament, a polished blade, or a finely painted vessel can attract attention, but the position of ordinary things may say more about the final hours of the settlement. Storage jars clustered in a room suggest planning and household management. Grinding stones near a work surface suggest daily food preparation. Ash inside an oven differs from ash fallen from the sky. A vessel crushed under roof debris differs from one broken and swept aside during ordinary use. What survives in the record suggests that the buried community was caught at a moment when many routines were still active. That is why the site feels less like a ruin in the usual sense and more like a paused life. Floors are especially important. A floor is a surface where human behavior becomes spatial. People sleep, cook repair tools, spill grain, drop beads, grind pigments, and leave behind tiny residues that later science can sometimes recover. Under magnification, a floor may reveal phytoliths from plants, microscopic charcoal fragments of bone, starch grains, mineral traces, ash lenses, or compacted pathways created by repeated movement. To the eye, it may look like hard earth. To careful excavation, it is a map of activity. The evidence remains incomplete because many traces disappear or become mixed, but when several kinds of evidence align, archaeologists can begin to distinguish a cooking area from a storage room, a workshop from a ritual space, a domestic corner from a place of public gathering. Seeds are among the smallest witnesses and among the most eloquent. Carbonized grain can survive for millennia because fire transforms it before decay consumes it. A handful of burned barley, wheat, millet, lentils, peas, or other crops can reveal what people planted, stored, ate, and feared losing. Weed seeds mixed into harvest remains may show how fields were cultivated, whether crops were irrigated, what season harvesting occurred, and how cleanly grain was processed. A surprising detail is that weeds can sometimes tell the story of farming more clearly than the crops themselves, because they grow under particular conditions and follow human disturbance closely. Scholars still debate the interpretation of some plant assemblages, but these tiny remains show that the civilization's economy was rooted in repeated skilled work rather than accidental abundance. Animal bones widen the picture. Cut marks reveal butchery. Burn patterns reveal cooking or disposal. Age profiles show whether animals were kept mainly for meat, milk, wool labor, or breeding. Wild species indicate hunting, trapping, fishing, or changes in the surrounding environment. If many young animals were slaughtered just before the catastrophe, it might suggest feasting stress, seasonal timing, or emergency consumption. No single explanation fully accounts for such patterns without context. Bones can also show trade and status. A rare marine shell far inland, a fish species from distant waters, or animal products not locally available may indicate exchange networks that connected the buried people to landscapes they never saw. Ceramics provide another dense archive. Clay vessels survive where wood, leather, fibre and flesh vanish. Their shapes reveal function. Their fabrics reveal clay sources and tempering materials. Their surfaces preserve firing conditions, soot handling marks, and sometimes residue. A pot made from local clay but decorated in a foreign style can speak of imitation migration fashion, marriage, or political influence. A vessel made elsewhere and carried into the settlement speaks of movement more directly. When pottery styles change through layers, archaeologists can build a relative chronology, watching the civilization's habits shift before the disaster. When the final burial layer seals a whole set of vessels at once, it provides a rare snapshot of what people were actually using near the end. Tools show the practical intelligence of the community. Stone blades, bone awls, spindle, whirls, loom, weights, grinding slabs, sickle inserts, scrapers, needles, fishing weights, and digging tools all point toward different kinds of labor. Wear analysis can reveal whether a blade cut plants hide, wood, or meat. Residue can sometimes identify fibers, plant sap, blood proteins, or mineral pigments. Even broken tools matter. A discarded tool shows a completed life cycle. An unfinished tool shows production. A tool left ready for use may show interruption. What survives in the record suggests a society in which many tasks were performed with tools worn smooth by repetition. The lost civilization is not only buried in drama, it is buried in maintenance. Architecture gives the evidence its skeleton. Walls reveal planning, household size, building phases, and sometimes social hierarchy. Doorways show movement. Courtyards show shared activity. Drains, hearths, benches, bins, platforms, and post holes reveal how people organize shelter and labor. Collapsed roofs can preserve construction methods that standing ruins often lose. Read impressions in clay beam sockets, woven mats, lashings, thatch, and plaster layers. The pattern of collapse can also help reconstruct the disaster. Walls fallen in the same direction may suggest seismic force flood pressure or wind-driven collapse. Roofs crushed under thick ash suggest rapid accumulation. Buildings filled from one side with debris suggest a flow. The settlement's destruction is written not only in what broke, but in how it broke. Human remains, when present, require the greatest care. They may reveal age, health, trauma, diet, ancestry, mobility, and relationships, but they also mark the point where scientific evidence meets human grief. A body found in a doorway may suggest escape, but it may also have been moved by collapse or water. A group found in a room may suggest sheltering, entrapment, ritual gathering, or later burial. The absence of bodies can be equally important. It may mean people fled successfully, that the dead were recovered, that preservation failed, or that excavation has not reached the right area. The evidence remains incomplete, and responsible interpretation avoids turning every skeleton into a dramatic final scene. Still, human remains remind the observer that catastrophe was endured by bodies, not abstractions. One of the most powerful tools for understanding the buried civilization is dating. Radiocarbon measurements from seeds, charcoal, bone, or wood can place the catastrophe within a range of calendar time. Volcanic ash can sometimes be chemically matched to a known eruption. Tree rings, if preserved, can narrow dates further. Sediment layers can be compared across a region, connecting the settlement's destruction to broader environmental events. Yet dating is rarely as simple as one number. Old wood can make an event seem older than it is. Disturbed layers can mix materials from different periods. Calibration creates ranges rather than perfect certainty. Scholars still debate many ancient chronologies, not because the methods are weak, but because the past is complicated. What the ground preserves then is not a single answer. It is a conversation between materials. Seeds speak to fields. Bones speak to meals and herds. Walls speak to household organization. Ash speaks to eruption, burning, or both. Mud speaks to water slope and force. Objects speak to trade habit and identity. Bodies speak to life histories and final danger. None is enough alone. Together they begin to restore the lost people from anonymity. The deepest revelation is that the civilization was not waiting to vanish. Its final layer is filled with preparations for continuant stored food, repaired buildings, used tools, maintained hearths, objects set aside for future use. Catastrophe interrupts a society still actively making tomorrow. That is what the ground preserved most clearly, not just destruction, but expectation. Beneath the sealing earth, the old world still leans forward into a future that never arrived. The most troubling evidence is not always the evidence of destruction. A thick ash layer, a collapsed roof, a wall pushed inward by mud, a floor sealed beneath debris, these things speak with a bluntness that is almost reassuring. They say that something happened, that force entered the settlement that the ordinary world broke. The harder clues are the ones that do not fit easily into a single pattern. They are the misplaced objects, the missing bodies, the repaired walls beneath fresh collapse, the valuables left behind in one house and carefully removed from another, the burn marks that appear where no fire should have reached, the traces of human return, above layers that seem to mark total abandonment. These are the details that keep the buried civilization from becoming a simple story. In one part of the settlement, destruction may look sudden and absolute. Floors are sealed with tools still in place. Storage jars remain full or partly full. A doorway is blocked by fallen debris before objects inside the room can be removed. Nearby, however, another building may show signs of clearing. Valuable portable items are missing. A passage has been dug through loose deposits. A wall seems patched after an earlier damage event, only to be buried later by a heavier layer. What survives in the record suggests uneven experience. The catastrophe did not strike every household in the same way at the same instant. Some people may have had warning, some may have returned, some may have lived through one phase of disaster, only to be defeated by another. This unevenness matters because it challenges the image of one final day swallowing everything at once. Popular memory prefers the frozen moment, a city living normally, then suddenly buried. Sometimes that is close enough to be useful, but it is rarely complete. Disasters often have rhythms. Ash falls, pauses, then falls again. Floodwaters surge, withdraw and return after a breached dam or a second storm. Earthquakes arrive in shocks and aftershocks. Fires spread unevenly depending on wind materials and the collapse of structures. The evidence remains incomplete, but contradictory layers may preserve not confusion in the archaeology, but complexity in the event itself. Burn layers can be especially deceptive. A blackened surface may suggest invasion eruption domestic fire ritual, burning accidental hearth spread, or post-disaster burning by survivors clearing space. Charcoal from a roof beam may mark the moment of collapse, or it may come from wood, already old when the building fell. A room filled with ash may have burned from within, or it may have received ash from the sky. At some sites, chemical analysis, microscopic study and careful excavation can distinguish volcanic ash from hearth ash, high-temperature burning from slow smouldering, and primary deposits from material washed in later. But the ground does not always make the distinction easy. Scholars still debate such traces because fire leaves dramatic evidence while hiding motive and sequence. The missing dead form another difficult clue. A catastrophe powerful enough to bury a settlement might be expected to preserve many victims, yet some sites contain surprisingly few human remains. This can mean several things. People may have escaped before the worst phase. Bodies may have been recovered by survivors. The area excavated may not include the places where people died. Water or later disturbance may have moved remains, or the catastrophe may have destroyed buildings more than people, leaving a survivable disaster that became a civilizational rupture only afterward through hunger, displacement, and loss of infrastructure. No single explanation fully accounts for the absence of bodies without close attention to local conditions. Still, absence shouldn't be mistaken for insignificance. A civilization can vanish from its old center, even if many of its people lived. Valuables create a similar puzzle. In some buried rooms, ornaments, fine vessels, tools, or imported goods remain behind. In others, they are absent while heavier objects remain. This may reveal differences in warning time, wealth access, or post-disaster salvage. A family that flees early can carry jewelry and small tools but not grinding stones. A family trapped suddenly leaves everything. Survivors returning later may retrieve metal heirlooms or ritual objects from buildings near the surface while leaving deeper rooms untouched. Later looters may disturb upper layers centuries afterward. What looks like panic may be organized evacuation. What looks like theft may be grief. The evidence must be read with caution because objects outlive intentions but do not explain them. There are sometimes signs of activity after the burial began. A pit cuts into disaster sediment. A hearth appears on top of collapsed debris. A few sherds from a later occupation lie above the sealed rooms. These traces suggest that the site did not immediately become unreachable or forgotten. People may have camped on the mound, searched for possessions, performed rites, or attempted to reclaim parts of the settlement. This afterlife of ruins is often overlooked, yet it can be one of the most human parts of the story. A destroyed home does not become archaeology overnight. For survivors, it remains a place of attachment, fear, obligation, and perhaps shame. They may return not because they believe they can rebuild, but because something or someone remains below. One lesser-known clue comes from insects, rodents, roots, and other small disturbances. Buried sites are not perfectly sealed vaults. Beetles may enter organic deposits. Rodents may drag seeds or bones from one layer into another. Roots may pierce floors and walls. Burrowing animals can carry small artifacts upward or downward. Later farmers may cut through ancient deposits with pits and post holes. These processes complicate interpretation, but they also show how long the buried place remained part of a living environment. Even silence has activity inside it. The settlement is dead as a human centre, but not dead as ground. Some clues contradict not the disaster, but assumptions about the people. Evidence of imported goods may appear in a settlement once thought isolated. Houses may show more equality than expected despite signs of regional complexity. A ritual deposit may contain ordinary domestic objects arranged in extraordinary ways. A supposed palace may turn out to be a storage facility, workshop, or communal hall. A structure thought defensive may be designed for flood control, animal management, or symbolic boundary making. Archaeology often advances by dismantling its own first impressions. The forgotten civilization becomes clearer when it is allowed to be strange on its own terms rather than forced into familiar categories. The destruction layer may also reveal resilience before final collapse. Repairs beneath the catastrophe suggest earlier damage survived. Reinforced walls, rebuilt hearths, raised floors, or redirected drainage channels show that the community had faced trouble before and responded intelligently. This makes the final disaster more sobering. The people were not passive, they had strategies. They observed, repaired, adapted, and continued. The catastrophe that buried them may not have been the first crisis, only the one that exceeded the tools available. Human societies often fail not because they do nothing, but because a familiar method meets an unfamiliar scale. There is also the possibility of multiple endings. The settlement may have declined before burial, with some areas already abandoned while others remained active. It may have been damaged by one event, partially reoccupied, and then sealed by another. It may have served different functions at different times: domestic storage, ritual refuge, salvage ground. A single layer of catastrophe can compress a longer history into what looks like one moment. The evidence remains incomplete and careful. Scholars resist the temptation to make every ruin dramatic in the same way. Yet the contradictions do not weaken the story. They deepen it. They show a civilization interacting with disaster rather than simply receiving it. The clues that do not fit are valuable because they keep the dead from becoming symbols only. They restore uncertainty, decision, and difference. One household may flee early, another may shelter. One neighborhood may burn, another may be filled by mud. One family may return to dig, another may never come back. Some memory may survive in neighboring settlements, while some names vanish almost immediately. The buried civilization is not a single frozen image. It is a broken sequence preserved unevenly by forces no one controlled, and this is where the mystery becomes most alive. Not in unsupported tales of vanished technologies or impossible powers, but in the disciplined unease created by real evidence that refuses to simplify. The ground says there was catastrophe. It also says there was preparation, survival, return loss, and perhaps more than one disaster braided together. Beneath the ash and mud, the forgotten world does not offer a clean ending. It offers something more truthful, a human ending uneven and unfinished, with enough clues preserved to draw the outline and enough missing to remind us that the past is not a solved object, but a landscape still partly buried. To explain the collapse, it is tempting to search for one master cause, one clean sentence that can stand over the buried settlement like an inscription. The mountain erupted, the river flooded, the earth shook, the climate shifted, the people overused the land, enemies came, trade failed, disease spread. Each explanation has its own force, and each may contain a piece of truth. But ancient catastrophe rarely behaves like a single falling stone. More often, it is a wall already cracked by many pressures finally pushed beyond repair. The forgotten civilization was buried by an event, yet it may have disappeared because several systems failed at once. The volcanic explanation is often the most visually convincing. Ash layers, pumice, burned roofs, heat-altered materials, and sudden sealing can point toward an eruption powerful enough to transform the settlement in hours or days. A volcanic disaster can bury fields as well as houses, poison water, kill animals, darken the sky, and make return nearly impossible. It can also preserve a site with remarkable clarity, freezing domestic life beneath ash in a way that seems almost unnaturally precise. What survives in the record may support this explanation strongly where volcanic material is chemically identifiable and spread across a wide region. Yet scholars still debate the scale, timing, and human impact of many ancient eruptions because ash can travel far from its source, and not every ash layer means the same level of destruction at ground level. The flood explanation carries a different kind of evidence. Thick mud deposits water-laid sediments, mixed debris, rounded stones, displaced objects, and erosion cuts through earlier occupation surfaces can suggest overwhelming water. A river may have changed course. A rare storm may have sent torrents through the valley. A natural dam may have failed upstream. A coastal surge may have pushed water into a settlement built too close to the edge of safety. Floods can be selective, destroying low neighborhoods, while sparing higher ones, which helps explain uneven damage. But water also confuses evidence. It moves objects from where they were used to where they finally settled. It can strip away bodies, scatter artifacts, and make the final arrangement look more chaotic than the actual sequence. No single explanation fully accounts for every deposit, unless sediment, architecture, and object placement are read together. Earthquake offers another strong possibility, especially where walls collapse in directional patterns, foundations shift, floors crack, and heavy storage vessels break where they stand. Seismic destruction can be sudden enough to trap objects in use, and widespread enough to damage an entire settlement without leaving the dramatic ash or mud of other disasters. But earthquakes are difficult to identify archaeologically with certainty. A collapsed wall may fall because of shaking, poor maintenance, flood pressure, abandonment, or later disturbance. Fire after an earthquake can mimic invasion. Rebuilding after earlier tremors can hide or complicate the sequence. The evidence remains incomplete, and responsible interpretation usually treats seismic collapse as part of a broader pattern rather than a simple label stamped onto every fallen stone. Climate stress may seem less cinematic, but it can be the deeper pressure beneath the visible disaster. A long drying trend can reduce harvests, shrink springs, push herders farther from the settlement, increase conflict over water, and weaken the surplus that once made complexity possible. Wetter phases can be equally dangerous if they increase erosion, flooding, landslides, or disease. The surprising detail is that climate does not need to destroy a society directly in order to make catastrophe decisive. It only has to narrow choices. A community with full granaries, flexible roots, and strong alliances might survive a major flood or eruption. A community already weakened by poor harvests, soil loss, and social strain may not. Climate is often less like a killer and more like a tightening room. Human pressure on the landscape is another explanation that has to be handled carefully. It is easy and sometimes too easy to blame ancient people for their own collapse. Deforestation, overgrazing irrigation, mismanagement, soil exhaustion, and settlement expansion can all increase vulnerability. Removing trees can loosen slopes. Grazing can reduce ground cover. Expanding fields into marginal land can make harvest more fragile. Water management systems can silt up or fail during extreme events. Yet ancient communities were not ignorant of their environments. Many managed land with skill over generations. The question is not whether they understood nature, but whether their knowledge was enough. When population ambition and environmental change pushed the system beyond familiar limits. Scholars still debate this balance, because the evidence can show stress without clearly assigning blame. Conflict is more difficult to see but cannot be dismissed. Burned structures, weapon injuries, fortifications, hurried abandonment, mass graves or destroyed storage areas can suggest violence. A weakened settlement after disaster may attract raids. Refugees may destabilize neighboring regions. Rival communities may compete for water grain or trade routes. However, destruction by conflict is often overdiagnosed in ruins. Not every burn layer is warfare. Not every wall is defensive. Not every skeleton with trauma died in battle. A civilization buried by natural catastrophe may later be disturbed by looters, survivors, or enemies adding human violence to an already broken record. What survives in the record suggests that conflict may have been part of the aftermath or broader stress, but it should not be presented as fact without clear evidence. Disease and hunger belong to the quieter theories, and they often leave subtler traces. Disaster can contaminate water, concentrate survivors in temporary camps, disrupt food systems, and weaken immunity. A community may survive the initial eruption, flood, or quake, only to lose many people in the following months. Such losses rarely form a neat destruction layer. They appear in changed burial practices, abandoned houses, altered diet, interrupted construction, and sudden demographic shifts. This is why the buried settlement's end may not be identical to the civilization's end. The city may have been buried in one event while the people's identity dissolved later through displacement, mortality, and absorption into other groups. The strongest explanation may be the least dramatic in wording cascading failure. A period of environmental stress reduces surplus. Population remains tied to fields and storage systems that are increasingly hard to maintain. Warning signs appear, but they resemble previous manageable troubles. Then a major event arrives: ashfall, floodquake, landslide, or several together. The settlement is damaged beyond practical recovery. Survivors move outward, placing pressure on neighboring communities. Trade routes shift. Ritual authority tied to the old place loses force. Within generations, the name of the civilization fades, even though its people and practices continue in altered form. This kind of explanation lacks the clean satisfaction of a single cause, but it fits the messy way societies actually break. Fringe theories sometimes gather around forgotten civilizations because silence invites invention. Lost advanced technologies vanished. Master races, cosmic punishments, or mysterious outside builders may appear in popular retellings. They can be dramatic, but they are unsupported where they ignore material evidence, local development, and known environmental processes. The real story does not need them. The buried floors, seeds, walls, bones, ash mud, and tools are already strange enough. They show a society complex in human terms, vulnerable in ecological terms, and preserved by a catastrophe whose power does not require fantasy. In the end, the competing explanations do not cancel one another. They form a hierarchy of likelihood and relationship. Some describe the trigger, others describe the vulnerability, others describe the aftermath. The buried civilization was probably not erased simply because nature struck, nor simply because people failed. It disappeared because a living system met a force or a chain of forces that exceeded its capacity to recover while preserving its identity. That is a harder answer, but a truer one. Collapse is rarely a door slammed shut. It is a series of doors closing faster than people can open new ones. The catastrophe does not stop at the edge of the buried settlement. It travels outward in disturbed fields, broken paths, missing traders, displaced families, empty shrines, and stories that no longer have a safe place to be told. A city, even a small one, is never only its houses. It is a knot in a wider net. Grain moves through it. Animals pass near it. Clay, stone, shell, metal, timber, salt pigments, and ideas flow toward and away from it in patterns built over generations. When that knot is cut, the whole net tightens and shifts. Some strands snap, others bend toward different centers. The buried civilization disappears locally first, but its absence becomes regional. The fields around the settlement may be the first wider casualty. If ash covers them thickly, planting becomes difficult or impossible, until weathering and labor change the surface. If mud buries them, boundaries vanish. Irrigation channels, paths, terraces, and drainage ditches are erased under a new skin of sediment. If a flood scours the land, fertile topsoil may be removed entirely in some places and dumped too deeply in others. A farmer who survives may stand on land still technically belonging to the same family, yet no longer recognizable as a field. The evidence remains incomplete, but ancient agricultural systems often depend on small inherited details: the height of a bank, the slope of a furrow, the timing of a seasonal channel, the place where water should be diverted before it becomes destructive. Catastrophe destroys these details as surely as it destroys walls. Beyond the fields are the roots. A settlement rises in part because people know how to reach it, and its importance depends on those repeated movements. After disaster, roads may be blocked by landslides, buried by ash, cut by new channels, or made dangerous by unstable ground. Traders who once stopped at the settlement now face a choice risk: the damaged route wait for recovery, or redirect toward a rival community. Once a route shifts, it can be difficult to bring back. Markets are habits as much as locations. If people discover a safer path, a better host, or a more reliable storage center, the old node may lose its role, even if some survivors attempt to rebuild nearby. In this way, physical catastrophe becomes economic reorganization. Political authority, if the settlement had it, suffers a similar wound. Power in ancient communities often rests on the ability to organize labor, store surplus, manage rituals, settle disputes, and maintain relationships with neighboring groups. A leader whose authority is tied to a buried center may find that authority weakened overnight. Granaries are inaccessible, ritual spaces are sealed, ancestral graves are unreachable. The visible signs of legitimacy have become part of the disaster layer. Some leaders may adapt guiding survivors into new settlements and transforming crisis into renewed authority. Others may lose their position to hosts' rivals or kin groups better placed to provide food. No single explanation fully accounts for post-disaster politics, but collapse often reveals that power depends on place more than rulers like to admit. Ritual consequences may be even deeper. If the settlement contained shrines, ancestral rooms, sacred springs, burial grounds, or ceremonial spaces, their loss would not be merely practical. It would rupture the community's relationship with the unseen order of the world. People might interpret the catastrophe as anger failure, warning purification, abandonment, or proof that old rituals no longer worked. They might move sacred objects to new places if they could recover them. They might establish replacement shrines in exile. They might avoid the buried center as dangerous ground or return to it precisely because danger made it sacred. Scholars still debate how disasters reshape belief because beliefs themselves rarely survive directly. But archaeology sometimes catches the aftermath in offerings placed above destruction layers, new ritual deposits, altered burial customs, or sudden changes in symbolic objects. The disaster may also reshape migration. Some survivors move only a short distance, remaining within sight of the old land. Others are pulled much farther by kinship trade, marriage, or necessity. Population movement can be seen indirectly when a material tradition appears outside its earlier homeland, when dietary signatures change in burials, when house forms spread, or when genetic and isotopic evidence suggest newcomers in neighboring regions. These movements are rarely simple invasions or neat replacements. More often they are braided processes, families arriving in small groups, marrying into local communities, bringing some customs while adopting others. What survives in the record suggests that catastrophe can scatter a people without erasing them biologically or culturally. Their civilization may die as a named center, while its descendants become part of many later histories. The surrounding communities may remember the disaster in different ways depending on their distance from it. Those close enough to suffer ashfall, flood damage, tremors, or refugees may carry vivid stories. Those farther away may remember mainly the disruption of trade, the arrival of strangers, or the sudden absence of goods once associated with the buried settlement. A pot style may stop moving along a route. A ritual object may vanish from exchange. A specific crop surplus may no longer arrive at seasonal gatherings. In economies without written ledgers, absence still leaves traces. A regional system can be read partly through what disappears. There may be climatic effects beyond the immediate area if the catastrophe is large enough, especially in the case of a major eruption. Volcanic aerosols can affect sunlight and temperature over broad regions, though the scale varies enormously depending on eruption size, chemistry, latitude, and atmospheric circulation. Local ashfall can devastate valleys, while the wider world notices only a hazy season. A truly large eruption can disturb harvests far away, but such claims require strong evidence and careful dating. The evidence remains incomplete in many cases, and scholars still debate links between specific eruptions and historical disruptions. The safer conclusion is that the buried civilization's catastrophe may have been local in its killing force, yet regional in its consequences, especially through migration, trade disruption, and memory. Ecologically, the disaster creates a new landscape. Ash can initially smother plants, but later enrich soils through weathering. Floods can destroy settlements while renewing fertility elsewhere. Landslides can dam streams, create wetlands, alter animal habitats, and redirect human movement. Fire can open ground for new growth. Catastrophe is not only an ending in environmental terms, it is also a rearrangement. This is one reason later people may return to the area without understanding the old settlement below. The land heals in ways that hide the wound. Grass covers ruins. New trees root in collapsed walls. Birds nest above rooms where people once stored grain. Nature does not remember as humans do. It recycles. For neighboring societies, the buried settlement can become a source of both warning and opportunity. Its abandoned territory may be feared at first, then explored, then reused. Its surviving people may bring labour knowledge and marriage ties. Its former trade partners may compete to inherit its roots. A rival centre may grow stronger because the old one has vanished. In later archaeological layers, this shift might appear as expansion, elsewhere. New fortifications, changes in storage, or increased regional standardization under another power. Catastrophe can create political space as well as ruin. Someone always lives downstream from another people's disaster. The legacy is therefore complicated. The forgotten civilization is buried, but the region is not frozen. It adapts around the absence. Its people become refugees, ancestors, teachers, labourers, spouses, rivals, and ghosts in other communities' stories. Its landscape becomes a warning, then a mound, then perhaps farmland. Its goods stop moving or move in altered forms. Its rituals fragment and reassemble. The world that replaces it is not entirely new, but it is no longer the same world. This is the wider meaning of the catastrophe. It reveals that civilizations are not isolated monuments waiting to fall. They are relationships stretched across land and time. When one centre is buried, the consequences move through every relationship that depended on it. The disaster that seems at first to belong to one silent city becomes a regional turning point written in altered paths, changed diets, shifting power, scattered traditions, and the slow disappearance of a name from human speech. The rediscovery begins long after the last person who knew the settlement's name is gone. By then the buried civilization has become a shape in the land if it is visible at all. It may appear as a low mound at the edge of fields, a strange rise where ploughs catch on stone, a scatter of pottery after rain, a darker patch of soil, a place where local stories say digging is unlucky, or simply an area that looks no different from the ground around it. The catastrophe that once filled the sky has shrunk into texture. It waits beneath roots paths, animal burrows, and centuries of later weather, not lost in the sense of being nowhere but lost, because no one remembers how to recognize it. Modern discovery often starts with an accident. A farmer turns up a sherd unlike the pottery of recent centuries. A road cut slices through a buried wall. A child finds a bead after a storm. A construction trench exposes ash mud brick or human bone. Sometimes local people have known about the mound for generations, while outsiders only later learn to ask the right questions. This detail matters because rediscovery is rarely the work of one heroic moment. It is usually a chain of noticing, local memory surface, fine survey, excavation, laboratory analysis, and years of argument. What survives in the record is often visible before it is understood. The first serious survey changes the mound from landscape into evidence. Archaeologists walk the surface in measured lines, collecting artifacts, noting concentrations of pottery stone tools, slag shell bone or burned clay. They map subtle rises and depressions. They look for signs of walls, streets, terraces, channels, and later disturbance. In dry landscapes, aerial photography or satellite imagery may reveal crop marks, soil marks, or shadow patterns invisible at ground level. In wetter regions, geophysical methods can detect buried features without opening the soil. Magnetometry may trace hearths, kilns, ditches, or burned structures. Ground-penetrating radar can suggest walls and voids. Electrical resistance can reveal differences in buried materials. The evidence remains incomplete until excavation tests it, but modern eyes can now see beneath the surface without immediately destroying it. Remote sensing has transformed the search for forgotten worlds. From above, a buried settlement can appear as geometry barely visible in fields, rectangles, lines, rings, platforms, mounds, and channels too regular to be natural. LIDAR, where vegetation hides ruins, can strip away the forest digitally, and reveal terraces, roads, foundations, and earthworks under tree cover. Multispectral imagery can detect moisture and vegetation differences caused by buried walls or ditches. These technologies do not replace excavation, and scholars still debate interpretations drawn from remote data alone. But they widen the first question. Instead of asking only where to dig, researchers can ask how the settlement relates to the entire landscape: fields, water systems, roads, cemeteries, quarries, and danger zones. Excavation, when it begins, is slow by necessity. The public often imagines archaeology as discovery by removal, but the deeper truth is that excavation is controlled destruction. Once a layer is removed, it cannot be put back exactly as it was. Every scrape of the trowel must be recorded because the relationship between objects is often more important than the objects themselves. A vessel on a floor, a seed cluster beside a hearth, a beam lying across a doorway, a child's bead near a threshold, all of these details gain meaning from position. The buried civilization is reconstructed not by taking treasures out of the ground, but by preserving information as the ground is taken away. The catastrophe layer may be recognized almost immediately. It has a different color, compactness, grain smell, or structure. Ash can lie pale and fine. Flood clay can be dense and laminated. Collapsed debris can appear as jumbled brick, stone, plaster, and charcoal. A sudden transition from occupation debris to sterile disaster deposit is one of the most dramatic experiences in field archaeology. Above it, later life. Below it, the old settlement. Between them, the event. No single explanation fully accounts for such a layer until specialists examine it, but even in the trench wall it announces a break in time. Geologists then become essential partners. They identify whether ash is volcanic, whether mud was laid by standing water, flowing water, debris flow, or slope wash, whether stones were transported by flood or collapse, whether soil formed slowly after abandonment, and whether cracks indicate drying seismic activity routes or later disturbance. The buried civilization cannot be understood by archaeology alone because the agent of burial belongs to earth science. A wall tells the story of human construction. The sediment around it tells the story of destruction. Only together do they begin to speak clearly. Dating methods add the chronology. Radiocarbon samples are taken from short-lived materials whenever possible. Seeds, twigs, textiles, charred food, or bone collagen if preservation allows. Volcanic ash, when present, may be matched chemically to known eruptions through its mineral and glass composition. Optically stimulated luminescence can sometimes reveal when sediment was last exposed to sunlight. Dendrochronology, if wood survives, and regional tree ring sequences exist, may place construction or destruction within remarkable precision. Yet dates are not magic keys. They come with ranges, uncertainties, contamination risks, and interpretive problems. Scholars still debate many timelines because a sample dates the material, not automatically the event people want to explain. Laboratory work brings the buried world into finer focus. Plant remains are floated from soil samples, allowing carbonized seeds to rise from sediment that once looked empty. Residue analysis tests pottery for fats, oils, waxes, resins, or fermented products. Isotopes in human and animal bones reveal diet mobility and environmental conditions. Micromorphology examines blocks of soil under a microscope turning floors and deposits into thin slices of behavior and formation process. Ancient DNA, where ethically and scientifically appropriate, may illuminate kinship or population movement. A lesser-known detail is that some of the most important discoveries from an excavation do not happen in the trench, but months or years later when a soil sample yields the seed parasite egg ash shard, or microscopic residue that changes the interpretation of an entire site. As evidence accumulates, the forgotten civilization begins to regain shape. Maps show the settlement's extent. House plans reveal neighborhoods. Tool distributions reveal workshops. Storage areas reveal food strategies. Cemeteries reveal age, health, and social difference. Imported materials reveal routes of connection. Disaster deposits reveal the event that sealed everything. Yet each answer produces new uncertainty. Were all buildings occupied at the same time? Did the richest houses belong to leaders, ritual specialists, or simply large extended families? Did the catastrophe kill many people, or mostly destroy the place that anchored them? Did survivors return? Did later communities know what lay below? The evidence remains incomplete, and this incompleteness is not failure. It is the condition of working honestly with the past. Rediscovery also raises questions of responsibility. The buried settlement is not only a scientific resource, it may be ancestral ground, a place tied to living communities, local identities, land rights, and memory. Human remains require respect. Sacred objects cannot be treated as curiosities. Local knowledge must not be brushed aside as folklore simply because it was not written in academic language. Modern archaeology at its best is not just extraction of information. It is negotiation between evidence ethics and the people for whom the past is not distant. By the time the excavators leave each season, the site has changed again. Trenches are covered or conserved. Finds go to laboratories, museums, storage rooms, or community institutions. Reports are written. Arguments begin. The buried civilization, silent for centuries, enters modern speech through cautious phrases, drawings, measurements, and interpretations. It is not resurrected. Nothing so simple happens, but it is recognized. The mound is no longer just a mound. It is a place where human expectation met geological force, and where the earth, by burying a world, preserved enough of it for strangers in another age to kneel in the dust and begin listening. A civilization can disappear twice. The first disappearance happens in the catastrophe itself, when houses are buried, fields are ruined, and people are scattered beyond the places that once made them a community. The second happens more slowly when memory fails to keep its shape. This second disappearance is less dramatic, but it may be more complete. Stone walls can survive underground for thousands of years. A name can vanish in 3 generations. A language can dissolve inside the speech of neighbors. A sacred story can survive as a warning no one fully understands. By the time modern excavators recognize the buried settlement, they are not only uncovering a destroyed place, they are confronting the strange fact that an entire human world can exist, flourish, suffer, and leave no clear name behind. The reasons for that forgetting are rarely simple. Some societies are remembered because they wrote and because their writing survived. Others are remembered because later kingdoms found them useful as ancestors, enemies, founders, or cautionary examples. Still others survive in myth because their ruins remained visible, impressive enough to demand explanation, even after their builders were gone. The forgotten civilization beneath the disaster layer lacks these advantages. Its settlement was hidden. Its survivors may have been absorbed. Its political identity, if it had one, may have been too local to interest later chroniclers. Its sacred places may have become unreachable. Its language may have left no inscription, or no inscription that has yet been found. The evidence remains incomplete, but the silence itself is a clue. History does not preserve everyone equally. Writing is often treated as the boundary between history and prehistory, but the buried civilization challenges that habit. A society without surviving texts is not a society without memory, intelligence, law, belief, or complexity. It is simply a society whose memory did not travel into the forms later scholars are trained to read. Its archive is material rather than literary. Walls replace sentences, seeds replace tax records, burial positions replace family names, pottery styles replace written signatures. What survives in the record suggests a people who organized labor, managed risk, exchanged goods, shaped identity, and understood their environment deeply, even if no scribe recorded the names of their leaders or the dates of their festivals. The absence of writing does not mean the absence of civilization. It means the past must be approached through a different kind of listening. There is a quiet injustice in the way catastrophe changes reputation. A city that collapses slowly may leave time for monuments, records, migrations, and stories of decline. A city buried suddenly may leave an extraordinary archaeological record, but a broken cultural one. Its very preservation comes at the cost of interruption. Later people may never see its walls, never reuse its temples, never incorporate its rulers into legend, never walk through its ruins and ask who built them. Because the site is hidden, it cannot become famous in antiquity. Because it is not famous in antiquity, later history has no ready place to put it. It becomes an anonymous layer under someone else's landscape. Yet anonymity is not insignificance. The rediscovered settlement may force a revision of the region's ancient map. It may show that complexity developed earlier than expected, or in a place once considered marginal. It may reveal trade routes that crossed supposedly isolated zones. It may preserve crops tools or house forms that change assumptions about economy and adaptation. It may show that people live successfully in a landscape modern observers once misread as too harsh, too remote, or too unstable. One surprising detail in archaeology is how often forgotten sites turn out not to be peripheral at all. They are peripheral only to the histories that survived. The civilization history forgot may also disturb neat stories of progress. Its people were not simply waiting for larger kingdoms to arrive and define them. They had their own rhythm of development, their own experiments with settlement, storage, ritual, and exchange. They may have lived without the monumental scale that later civilizations used to advertise power, but that does not make their world small. A community can be sophisticated in its water management craft traditions, ecological knowledge and social obligations without building pyramids or palaces. Archaeology often reveals forms of complexity that do not resemble imperial grandeur. This matters because the ancient world was never only a sequence of famous empires. It was a dense field of local societies, many of them now nameless, many of them essential to the larger human story. The catastrophe adds another complication. When a society is preserved by disaster, it can be mistaken for a civilization defined by disaster. The final layer becomes so vivid that it overwhelms everything before it. Ash mud, collapsed walls, and sudden abandonment attract the eye, while the longer centuries of adaptation beneath them require more patient attention. But the buried people were not created by their ending. Their most important achievements may lie in the quiet fact that they sustained a way of life across generations in a risky landscape. They learned soils, seasons, materials, routes, and relationships. They built a world stable enough that its interruption still feels shocking. No single explanation fully accounts for their disappearance if it ignores the duration that came before collapse. Modern rediscovery changes their place in history, but it cannot fully restore them. Archaeologists can reconstruct diets, building methods, trade links, and environmental conditions. They can map rooms, sequence layers, date destruction, and identify traces of migration. They can sometimes recover faces indirectly through skeletal remains, health patterns, and burial practices. But they cannot recover everything that made the civilization itself. They cannot hear the language spoken in the courtyards. They cannot know the exact names of the dead unless writing or later tradition provides them. They cannot easily distinguish grief from ritual, fear from reverence, ordinary habit from symbolic action. Scholars still debate these limits, not because they know too little to speak, but because they know enough to recognize how much remains beyond reach. There is also the question of descendants. The civilization may be forgotten as a name, but the people may not have vanished biologically. Survivors likely entered neighboring communities, carried children into new households, and became ancestors under different identities. Their practices may have continued in altered forms invisible, because later cultures took them in and renamed them. A decorative pattern, a crop choice, a ritual posture, a settlement preference, or a memory of dangerous ground may be the afterlife of the buried world. What appears archaeologically as disappearance may in human terms be transformation. This distinction matters. Civilizations can end while people endure. The rediscovery, therefore, does more than add another site to the map. It reminds us that history is full of missing centers. Places that mattered deeply to those who lived there may leave no place in written tradition. Communities that shaped trade, farming, craft, and belief may survive only as deposits beneath later fields. A catastrophic layer can reveal them by accident, not because they were unimportant, but because burial protected what ordinary history neglected. The forgotten civilization becomes a correction to arrogance. It warns against confusing fame with significance and silence with emptiness. By the time the evidence is assembled, the settlement begins to stand again in the imagination, though never completely. Its rooms regain functions, its paths regain direction, its fields regain seasons, its people regain labor, hunger, skill, fear, and hope. They remain nameless, but they are no longer nothing. They become part of a wider understanding of the ancient world as a place crowded with experiments in living, many of them cut short, many of them folded into later societies without credit. The civilization history forgot is not rescued from death. That would be too easy and untrue. It is rescued from complete disappearance. There is a difference. The walls remain broken, the old language remains silent, the final day cannot be reversed. But the buried layer allows the forgotten people to re-enter human time. They return not as legend, not as spectacle, and not as a simple warning, but as a real society whose traces ask to be read carefully. Under the earth they waited without intending to. In the present they changed the story simply by proving that there was more there than memory kept. The warning under the earth is not that all civilizations are doomed in the same way. That would be too simple, and the past is rarely simple for long. The buried settlement does not say that every river will drown its people, every mountain will betray its villages, every field will become a grave, or every society that grows complex must collapse. It says something subtler and more difficult to dismiss. It says that civilizations live inside agreements with landscapes they do not fully control. For a time those agreements can appear stable. Water comes when expected. Soil answers labor with harvest. Trade paths remain open. Buildings hold. Rituals give rhythm to uncertainty. Then the scale of nature changes, or the scale of human pressure changes, or both change together, and an old balance can fail faster than memory can adjust. The forgotten civilization beneath the disaster layer is therefore not an exotic exception. It is a concentrated example of a condition shared by all settled human worlds. Its people built intelligently. They used the resources around them, organized food, shaped homes, maintained crafts, formed relationships across distance, and found meaning in a landscape that was both generous and dangerous. What survives in the record suggests competence, adaptation, and continuity, not foolishness. Their disappearance becomes more haunting because we're not obviously doomed from the beginning. They did what human communities do everywhere they learned a place well enough to trust it. That trust is necessary. Without it, no one plants orchards, digs canals, builds walls, buries ancestors, or teaches children the paths between home and field. Civilization depends on the belief that tomorrow will resemble today enough for labour to matter. Yet the buried settlement reveals the hidden cost of that belief. A society's deepest knowledge is often local, seasonal, and inherited. It is powerful within the range of known experience, but it may fail when confronted by an event outside living memory. The flood higher than the oldest marker, the eruption after centuries of quiet, the earthquake stronger than any story, the drought longer than any storage plan, the chain reaction that turns several manageable risks into one impossible crisis. Scholars still debate the precise causes of many ancient disasters, but they often agree on this broader truth: vulnerability is built gradually before collapse becomes visible. The warning is also about memory. The civilization was not only buried physically, it was buried historically. Its name slipped away. Its final day, if carried by survivors, changed form, thinned, and perhaps vanished into other traditions. The ground preserved what people could not, but preservation without memory is a strange mercy. Walls endured while language disappeared. Seeds endured while songs disappeared. Tools endured while the names of the hands that used them disappeared. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the silence that followed, but the silence itself teaches something important. Human history is not the same as the human past. History is what survives in forms that later ages can recognize. The past is larger, more crowded, and far less fair. Modern rediscovery gives the forgotten people a kind of second presence, but it also places responsibility on those who interpret them. The temptation is to turn them into symbols, victims of nature, victims of their own mistakes, proof of a theory, warning signs arranged neatly for the present. But they deserve more than that. They were not living metaphors. They were families, workers, children, elders, farmers, craft specialists, mourners, travellers, and believers. Their final layer should not reduce them to disaster. It should restore the fullness of what disaster interrupted. Their buried world matters because it was alive before it was lost. Still, the warning reaches forward. Modern societies are larger, richer, more technically capable, and more scientifically informed than the lost settlement beneath the earth. They can monitor volcanoes, map floodplains, model climate, reinforce buildings, store food globally, and communicate danger across continents in seconds. These advantages are real. But scale brings new dependencies. Cities rely on distant water, distant energy, distant food systems, and invisible networks that few people fully understand. A disruption in one place can travel through trade migration, finance, disease, infrastructure, or conflict, just as the buried settlement's catastrophe once travelled through fields, roots, refugees, and memory. The past does not repeat mechanically, but it does reveal patterns of fragility. One of the most uncomfortable patterns is that danger often becomes normal before it becomes disastrous. People rebuild in flood zones because the last flood was survivable. They farm volcanic slopes because the soil is rich and the mountain has been quiet. They depend on narrow water systems because they have worked for generations. They dismiss small warnings because small warnings happen all the time. Ancient communities were not uniquely blind to risk. They were human. Their decisions were shaped by attachment need, inheritance, politics, hope, and the practical difficulty of leaving everything behind. The same forces still shape decisions today, only with different tools and larger numbers. The buried civilization also teaches that collapse is not always total disappearance. Some people survive, some traditions move, some skills are absorbed elsewhere, some fragments of identity outlast the center that once held them. This matters because catastrophe is never only an ending. It is also a sorting of what can be carried. Seeds, stories, tools, children, memories and habits may cross into a new world. But what cannot be carried is equally important: the exact arrangement of place, the authority of old shrines, the familiarity of fields, the social meaning of walls, the accumulated confidence that home will remain home. A civilization can continue in fragments while still losing the thing that made it itself. Beneath the earth, the settlement remains a patient witness. It does not warn in a voice. It warns through arrangement: a jar left where it was useful, a floor sealed while life was ongoing, a wall collapsed before repair could begin, a layer of ash or mud dividing one human rhythm from all that followed. The warning is not loud, but it is steady. It says that ordinary life is more fragile than it feels from inside. It says that survival depends not only on strength, but on flexibility, memory, humility, and the willingness to notice when an old landscape has begun to change. The final lesson is not despair. The past is full of catastrophe, but it is also full of adaptation. People endure, migrate, rebuild, remember, forget, and begin again. The forgotten civilization was buried, but its rediscovery proves that even silence can be opened. Even a nameless people can return to the human story through careful attention. The warning under the earth is therefore double-edged. It reminds us that no world is permanent, and it reminds us that no world is meaningless because it ended. Under the sealed rooms, under the hardened layer of disaster, the lost settlement still holds its last proof that before it vanished it lived completely. The earth is quiet again. Above the buried settlement, wind moves across the surface without ceremony. It bends, grass lifts, dust touches stones that were never meant to become markers. The catastrophe has long since lost its heat, its roar, its sudden darkness. The people who ran from it, or stayed within it, or returned afterward with grief in their hands are gone. Their children are gone. The names they used for the river, the mountain, the fields, and the rooms of their houses have slipped beyond recovery. What remains is not a voice exactly, but a pressure in the ground, a shape left by lives interrupted. There is something humbling in that. Human beings build as if building can argue with time. A wall says this place matters. A storehouse says there will be another season. A burial says remember us here. A path worn between houses says we belong to one another in ways repeated so often they no longer need to be spoken. And for a while these declarations hold. They hold through ordinary storms, ordinary hunger, ordinary fear. They hold long enough for children to become elders and for repairs to become tradition. Then sometimes the scale changes. A mountain opens, a river rises, a slope fails, the sky darkens, the ground begins to move. In one terrible interval, the world that seems solid becomes temporary, and everything a people believed would continue is forced into a new form. Some of it becomes memory. Some of it becomes exile. Some of it becomes another people's inheritance. And some of it sinks into silence, waiting under layers no one living understands. Yet silence is not emptiness. Beneath the ash and mud, the forgotten civilization kept its final arrangement. It kept the jar, the hearth, the seed, the wall, the threshold, the tool worn smooth by use. It kept enough for the future to know that people had been here not as shadows in a legend, but as makers of a real and fragile world. Their story does not return complete. It never can. But it returns with a kind of dignity assembled from small things that survived, because the earth covered them before time could scatter them entirely. And perhaps that is the final image to hold not the moment of destruction, but the quiet room beneath the ground, sealed in darkness, carrying the evidence of morning. A place where someone once expected another day, and where the long patience of the earth preserved the shape of that expectation after everything else was gone.